welcome to a brand new episode of Discovering Doctor Who. Today the episode I'm going to be talking about is a bit of a different one. It's Love and Monsters. The first of, I assume it's the first of what is being referred to as a Doctor-Lite episode, in which there is very little of the Doctor in this episode. He appears in, I want to say, maybe 5 minutes total of the entire episode, so it was definitely very strange in that regard. And this is actually an episode that several videos back in the Discovering Doctor Who series, some of the commenters started mentioning that they were interested to see what I think of this episode. At least I'm pretty sure it's this one, because some of them really don't like it, and this is apparently a very divisive episode, and I can understand why. But I'll get into my real opinion on this episode overall at the end, because I think you might be surprised what I think of it. But let's get into what I think were some of the best aspects of this episode, and the first of which is actually Elton, I believe his full name is Elton Poe, but Elton's tie-ins with the previous events in the Doctor Who series, obviously primarily the new series, starting with the I forgot the name, the Nestine consciousness, when all the mannequins came to life, and really all the other major events that occurred there in England throughout the series so far. And just the way that his experiences tied into that were just, I just found them to be very interesting, and just a very clever way of really tying him into the mythos of Doctor Who overall, even though I assume he's basically a one-off character in the grand scheme of the series. Now, the second best part of this episode is actually Moaning Myrtle. I mean Ursula Blake, who is played by Shirley Henderson. Now, if you've seen Doctor Who, the Doctor Who movies, you know who Moaning Myrtle is, or, well, you know who she is, and if you've also read the books, you know who Moaning Myrtle is. I'm rambling. But I thought that she did a good job in this episode. Her voice, I'm surprised to find that that's apparently her real voice. I thought it was sort of a put on from where she was a ghost, or she played Moaning Myrtle in the Doctor Who, the Harry Potter movies. But apparently that little mousy voice is her real voice, and it's interesting. But overall as a character, I found her to be quite interesting in this episode, to be quite honest. Even near the end, it's just like, even though her voice is like, it's hard to get used to for me. I don't mean that to sound derogatory or anything. It's just it's a very different voice. But as the episode approaches its end, you just sort of get used to it, and you just basically come to accept it, or I know I did anyway. Now, my third favorite part of this episode is Jackie's character development. Now, I know one of the commenters has said that they really don't like Jackie, and they're actually farther in the show than I am, and they still don't like Jackie, and to a point I can understand that, but I honestly feel like that there was a very significant aspect of character development for her in this episode. There were a lot of parts leading up to that, though, with her that were really, it was cringe-worthy to say the least. It was just, your typical Jackie fare. She was being really annoying, being blatantly obvious in that she was hitting on, trying to seduce Elton. It was awkward and weird, and yeah, again, that aspect of Jackie I still don't like. But when she gets the call from Rose and she just sort of snaps out of it, it's just like, what transpires after that is just amazing. It's like, as a character, I feel like in that respect she grew monumentally in my eyes. Now, whether or not that will actually carry over into future episodes, I don't know. She may just continue to be her usual self, sometimes annoying, sometimes a really good character, but I honestly do hope that it carries on, and that she sort of maintains a little bit more of the seriousness about her. Could be, maybe not, I don't know. She's a character, they developed her the way they wanted to, who am I to say? But my fourth and final, only 4 in this episode, my fourth and final favorite part of this episode is the episode's human element. And I know that one major problem that a lot of people have with this episode, understandably so, is the fact that the Doctor and Rose just aren't there very much. But it sort of turns the camera around, or it turns the idea around, and we look at all these events, we look at these different goings-on from a human's perspective, and we don't really get that much. I mean, we have Rose, but at this point, especially, she's very much tied into the Doctor's life, and, you know, she's living the life of an extraterrestrial, so to speak. She's a time traveler. She's a space traveler. But to get sort of that connection to regular human beings that were fairly well developed. I mean, for a single episode, they aren't greatly developed by far, but I mean, it's like for simple one-off characters, they did a pretty decent job with them, and I honestly really like that. And to show you how much a human element can really make the show feel better for me at times is the third episode of the new run, episode 3 with Charles Dickens. Yeah, Charles Dickens. That was the one that drew me in. The fact that it had a human element. It wasn't just the crazy sci-fi stuff that everything is really weird. No, it was that pulled you back and really got you into the fact that there are, I mean, even though they meet real life people throughout the series, that it actually for once focuses on the life of just a regular person. And I really like that. Or actually a group of regular people. Even though they sort of got, infiltrated by an alien and all that. But that's besides the point. Now, moving on from the positive aspects of this episode, moving into the negatives. And unfortunately, usually I only pick out one, maybe two. This one had a few more, unfortunately. The first negative aspect of this episode is really the overall lack of the Doctor and Rose. And this is a part of it that was pointed out to me from the beginning by commenters that as I mentioned before. It's the first Doctor-Lite episode, and the absence is definitely felt. We're basically having to go this entire episode with, by and large, people we have no idea who they are. We have to grow at least the slightest attachment to them from the beginning, and just the Doctor and Rose aren't really there. They're in like a few seconds for a few cutscenes here or there. Actually, that reminds me. In the very beginning of the episode, we see the Rose and the Doctor up against some alien. I can't really remember. I don't know if its type was even mentioned. But what ensues is basically a Benny Hill skit of the Doctor, Rose, and this alien going through these doors back and forth. And don't get me wrong, I love Benny Hill. But it felt incredibly out of place in this episode, especially in the beginning where it looks like it's supposed to be serious, and then all of a sudden it's like this goofy chase back and forth. I just couldn't get behind that. That just was really weird, and I'm pretty sure as I was watching it, I was just kind of like, okay. Now, part of me honestly thought maybe he was just making that up, like he was describing it that way, and maybe that's the way it was supposed to be intended, like, he just sort of told it that way, but I don't know, the rest of the episode seemed like it was all based off of, the actual, well, quote, actual events that occurred in the episode, so it's hard to say, but the lack of them there, and then some of the scenes just felt weird. Now, the second negative aspect of this episode would be Elton's random dance segments. Now, the incorporation of music I could appreciate because, he obviously really liked music. Their little group, what they call themselves, Linda. I can't remember what the acronym stood for, I'll put it here. But it's like, there's music there, but it's just, and there would just be these random cuts of him, like, dancing in the background of his camera. Why? It basically just seemed like space filler, but they only lasted like 10 seconds. If you're gonna have filler, make it last longer than 10 seconds. I don't know. That was just, like I said, there's just another part of this episode that really bothered me. Now, the third negative aspect of this episode, it's when Elton finally learns what happened the night that he originally met the Doctor. And the reason this bothers me is he remembers specifically seeing the David Tennant Doctor, the 10th Doctor. He specifically remembers seeing him. And the Doctor remembers seeing him before as well. Now the problem with this is, Rose has been with the Doctor since he changed, at the beginning of or at the end of the last season or series. So, at what point was he alone to go after the shadow creature? And would not Rose have been there in some form? Now, I know that the Doctor probably goes and does a lot of things on his own in the background, but as far as we know, as just viewers of the show, they're together pretty much all the time. And for the fact that there would be this random gap where the Doctor in his current form shows up to get rid of the shadow creature or whatever it was, this doesn't make any sense. Chronologically, it makes no sense. And I know some people will say, well, it's timey-wimey stuff. And I get it that there are certain aspects of the show where it's you can't really be too serious about the logic, but it's really annoying, and it's just one part of this episode that really made it feel poorly written. I honestly, when it first had the flashback, I expected to see the outline of one of the old Doctors, one of the previous classic Doctors. That would have been awesome to see, or maybe even the 9th Doctor, to see him, or it's again, or even just his outline, to have that connection to the past. But no, it was David Tennant. And that part just really bothered me. I won't ramble about that anymore, but it's just, it was really annoying. Now, the fourth and final negative aspect of this episode is the ending. The ending was really weird and weak. And, I mean, there have been weird endings before that aren't necessarily bad, but to end an episode with this really creepy, is Ursula her head is on this slab of concrete, and it basically they made this faux happy ending that really was unnecessary. Admittedly, it would have been darker if Elton was just alone and, left without anyone, including Ursula, who he loved. But it wouldn't have been as weak. It would have been dark, but it would have been stronger overall. But instead we get this, they're making smoochy faces and, sexual innuendo, and all she is this head sticking out of a concrete slab. Really poor ending, just really weird and strange way to end it. Before I get to my final thoughts on the episode, I do have a quote of the episode, and I guess it's actually not technically from the episode, but is a quote that Elton says came from Stephen King, who happens to be my favorite author. And the quote is, "Salvation and damnation are the same thing." And I guess unless you've actually seen the episode, that quote and how it ties in doesn't make a lot of sense. But, I mean, just overall, even outside this episode, that's a really powerful quote. I think it's a very powerful line. I won't really analyze it much, but it was just something that really stuck out in this episode, in which there honestly weren't really that many quotable moments, unfortunately. Now, as for my final thoughts on this episode, like I said before, I know a lot of the commenters don't really care for this episode, and I honestly kind of liked it. Now, before you start hitting the dislike button, let me say this. It is definitely the weakest episode of this entire season so far. There is no doubt about that. I don't know. I tried to compare it to some of the older episodes, from the previous season or series, but it's just on its own in regard to this season. It's definitely the weakest, but it's not necessarily a bad episode. It's not one that I would revisit for sure, but overall, again, I really like the human aspect of it. Jackie's character development was good, and honestly, one of my primary issues, especially back with the episodes with the Slitheen, when it would cut away from the Doctor and Rose, the moments without those two just always felt very off. They never felt good, and I'm pretty sure those episodes were all written by Russell T Davies. This episode was also written by him, but it did manage to carry just normal human characters, including Jackie, with very minor aspects of the Doctor, and it was overall a fairly well-written episode. Now again, it had some major negatives, some major problems, but it wasn't bad. It was just weak. I would say it was probably average overall. And given that all the episodes this season have been pretty great in my opinion, you know, to just be average really makes you the weakest link, unfortunately. At least so far, again, in this series / season. So that's really my final thoughts on it. It's like, not great, definitely, not even necessarily good, but average. And definitely the weakest episode of the season so far. I think I've said that like 3 times. I apologize. But anyway, everyone, thank you very much for watching this episode of Discovering Doctor Who. I would love to hear your thoughts on this episode. I know that a lot of you have told me your thoughts on it before, but really, I just like to let me know what you think of my opinion of it, really. It's like, you know, the fact that I didn't really hate it. Or are there some of you out there that, you know, really liked the episode? I'm sure that there's some of you out there, especially if this episode has a lot of people divided. I guess I fall more into the middle like I do with most things, but again, I didn't find it that bad, but it also wasn't very good. And, you know, that's all I can really say about it. And everyone, thank you again very much for watching, and I'll see you next time on the next Discovering Doctor Who.